Hey everybody. So normally when I come out and talk about books, I'm just talking about the books and maybe a little bit about the writer, but this time I want to talk about this guy right here at a little more length than I normally do and one of his books. I will talk about other books of his and other videos, but this time I want to focus on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's my first American edition copy of it. I do not have a first British edition, but someday maybe I will. So Douglas Adams had an interesting career. He always wanted to be a writer, so he went to school to do that. When he graduated, he wanted to kind of break into TV and radio because remember this was early 1970s. And if you're in London, apparently that's what you wanted to do was break into TV and radio because people were still doing radio plays and radio shows and radio comedies, especially on BBC. Not quite as much here, but it was kind of coming out of that time period where radio was all people had and TV was kind of really taking over. There were still, your parents and grandparents still remembered when people would actually, listen to radio dramas. And there were still some of them going on, and he wanted to kind of break into that world. So he wrote the book, or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, originally as a radio play, but we'll get to more of that in a second. But when he broke in to writing, he was actually working in London, and this guy named Graham Chapman discovered him and said, "Hey, I want you to come work for me." Graham Chapman, you may remember, is part of Monty Python, right? So Monty Python needs no introduction to anybody. They're just freaking Monty Python. He worked on a sketch for them, a couple sketches for them, one of which was sort of famous called Patient Abuse. If you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube, different places. He co-wrote part of the Marilyn Monroe sketch that wound up in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which everybody has seen 27 times. If you haven't seen it, it's great. Drink while you're seeing it. It really helps. Um, but having worked on Monty Python Flying Circus and actually showing up a couple times in it, what do you do after that, right? So what's your follow-on look like? Well, of course, he got to work on Doctor Who. So at this point, you get to work on Monty Python, you get to work on Doctor Who. Kind of jealous of his career, right? I would just love to be in the room when some of this stuff goes on, much less actually get to work on it and contribute to it. But now, if you think about that for a second, he's now got the sci-fi background, he's got the comedy background. Where do you go next? So now that you've got this education as a writer, you've got this background where you've worked with freaking Monty Python of all groups, right? And Doctor Who, both world known for comedy and sci-fi, and you're now kind of everywhere in that you'd ever want to be. What's next? So Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He was kind of kicking around. What do you want to do? What's next? Sort of what are you going to do after this? And he was apparently in Austria. And the idea for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came to him when he was passed out drunk in a field one day, not passed out, but drunk, laying in a field one day in Austria near Innsbruck, where he was looking up at the stars, holding a copy of Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe, and was like, you know what? I think somebody should write the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And if you've read this book, it makes a lot of sense that this actually came out of somebody being drunk. It's a fantastic book. If you have not read it, highly recommended. But there's a couple of other interesting things about this thing that you have to understand. So first off, it was not originally written as a novel; it was written as a radio drama, which you can still find online in different places. So if you get the chance and you're interested, that's sort of the place to be. It was a 1980s TV series, sort of a limited TV series that BBC put together. It was okay for the 1980s. There was a 1984 text adventure game and an early 2000s film that I think is on Disney Plus now, but the film was the film. It wasn't super fantastic. It wasn't super terrible. It wasn't awesome. But the thing about this book, the premise of it coming from that sort of Hitchhiker's Guide to Europe, well, how do you kick it off? How do you kind of get to that part where you're a hitchhiker around the galaxy? So basically, the book opens with a demolition crew showing up to Earth of this group called the Vogons. And a Vogon construction fleet kind of was trying to make this hyperspace bypass and just decided, hey, you know what? Earth is in our way. We're going to knock it out of the way because of this thing we're trying to build. Because, who hasn't been heard of stories of eminent domain where somebody's home gets sort of taken because we got to build a highway overpass? Well, Circus a galactic one, right? Well, our hero of the story, Arthur Dent, was sort of rescued by his friend who had named Ford Prefect, who had kind of come to Earth to study it, to write passages for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, among other things. And Ford kind of rescues Arthur and they hitchhiker ride with the Vogons, and then you're off to the races, and you get things like Trillian shows one of the you get to explore the galaxy through the eyes of this human who'd never seen it before, with other aliens. In particular, Trillian is one that's had been taken from Earth, so you got a second human kind of popping up around with you too. But the president of the galaxy pops in, who's an interesting guy named Zaphod Beeblebrox, who had two heads. He had one sort of surgically added at one point, because why not? One of the really interesting characters in this book, though, and one of the parts of the video game that I wanted to mention was the text adventure game was kind of in the lines of Zork. So it was a video game before graphics were really all that advanced, and a lot of video games didn't have graphics. They were just sort of you text typing things in the computer, go west, go east, and it would tell you what happened next. It would tell you what you could see, and it would just be words on a screen. It wouldn't be any graphics. And I remember playing that game when I was a kid. I was 12 or 13 when it came out, or when I got a copy of it. And I could never get past the chronically depressed robot. He would always bore me to death. But Marvin, the paranoid android who is shockingly depressed, is an interesting character. Basically, what happens with poor Marvin is he's so advanced and he's so smart, everything bores him, and he becomes very depressed. So he's got this artificial intelligence robot kind of traveling the galaxy with him. That pops into the story from time to time, who's just too depressed for his own good. And whenever you try to have a conversation with him, you really want to off yourself. Um, so the book itself is absolutely hilarious. It is very dry, very British humor. But it launched a whole series, and who better to launch a series than a guy who's into radio dramas and serial TV, right? So he launched a whole series. It was supposed to be a trilogy, and then he kind of jokingly added a fourth part to it. And then after he passed away, he had a fifth part that was being worked on, and it eventually came out. There is another one that popped out in 2009 that I have not read. But the original books are Hitchhiker's Guide, Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Life, the Universe, and Everything, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, are mostly harmless. And then there's another one called And Another Thing that I have not read. I have read the first five. But the thing about this book that causes me to think more often than anything else is it gives you a chance to say, not only are we the only ones out there in the world, but are we do we have a galaxy around us that just sort of doesn't care that we exist because, well, they're so busy with their own daily lives. And sometimes we look at it like, what is that bigger world out there? And I think it's kind of an interesting take on it. But the take of, hey, let's just hitchhike our way around the galaxy, I thought was incredible. And as a TV show, it's okay. The early 80s cinematography is what it is. The movie was not great. I think it deserves a better film at some point. But the book is definitely one to keep going. It's not a long read if you pick it up. It's 200 pages or so. You can read it in a weekend pretty easily. It is absolutely hilarious, and you will walk away in stitches. The cast of characters is highly, highly, highly creative. It's anything from President of the Galaxy to a chronically depressed android. The reason I wanted to start talking about these books is I think they're one of the ones in the science fiction world that get overlooked now. In my generation, I'm 52. Everybody had read or at least seen or something one of these books. And now I think they get talked about more than they get read. And that's part of a growing trend where everybody's like, oh, sure, I've read that. Well, have you? And everybody's like, yeah, 42, that's the answer to the universe. Well, sure. In a later book, not in Hitchhiker's Guide, they want to understand the answer to life, the universe, and anything. So they build this giant computer to go off and discover that answer. I think it's in part three of the series. The answer turns out to be 42. And then somebody's like, great, can you explain how's that the answer? Because you asked the computer, right? You're going to get a number. And the computer's like, okay, it's going to take me a while to explain it, So it takes longer to understand the question than it does to understand the answer sometimes, which is a weird philosophical way to approach things. Sometimes, and how often have we found people in our daily lives are like, oh, I know the answer to that, right? But they don't really understand why it's the answer. They just know what they're supposed to say. And sometimes they really didn't fully understand the question. They've just heard that answer somewhere, so they know to spit that back, right? And as a former teacher myself at the university level, you know, there's some interesting times when students know how to memorize their way through a test, but they don't really understand why it's the answer. And that's going to hurt them later on in application. And some fields it's fine, but I'm a physicist and we really want people to understand stuff because if you just kind of spit back an answer, what happens if something comes that's a little bit out of place and you push the wrong button? It's like, because that's the button it said to have, but one little thing was out of place. Next thing you know, you blow up a nuclear reactor. It's a bad thing. You truly want people to understand both the question and the answer. And I think Douglas Adams, in that third book really kind of drives that home that sometimes it's important to know both sides, but he does it in a funny way. He's a great writer, fantastic stuff, very dry, very British humor. Um, One of the best sci-fi comedies I've ever come across. Please give it a look. I don't want to give away any spoilers for people that haven't read it, but just the Vogon hyper transport thing destroying the Earth, I thought was a fantastic way to kick off a book to say, hey, how do we get a human off of Earth and do it in a hurry? Right? Because you don't want to spend the front two-thirds of your book saying, okay, we've got a human, we've got to get him into space. How do we do that? Well, hitchhiking is a good, quick answer. So it's a story that does just kind of move. So if you have a chance to pick it up, please do. Check out the radio broadcast. I found it by Googling it pretty fast. And if you haven't seen the movie, they're okay, but they will give away they will kind of mess up the book for you. Have not read it, pick up a copy. It's on Kindle, hardcover, paperback. You could probably find it at any library. Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Funny, funny stuff. Great writer whose history I kind of pulled up just to do this video. Did not realize he worked with Monty Python, which explains a lot after reading this book, actually. And his Doctor Who background does kind of come out, right? So in this, you do kind of see those essence of Doctor Who, and you do see that sort of essence of Monty Python. So it's sort of a Monty Python sketch in a book, if you want to look at it that way, or at least in a 5-part book. I'm a big fan of his. There's other books I have not talked about of his that I think are certainly well worth the time. And throughout my time doing these videos, we'll probably get to those too, because I've read a whole bunch of his. So everybody have a great day. Don't forget to click like, subscribe, or follow, and check this book out. I would love to have a discussion with somebody else who's read this. If you want to read it and then come back and say, hey, let's do a live cast on it, let me know. I'm your guy. Everybody have a great day.